This is my happy place. This is me. And base camp is fun, but sometimes doing these presentations, a little bit of preparation, a little bit of stress. I think, if only I were fishing. That's not true. This is components, the advanced part of components. And we are going to start out by creating a face me component, and we're going to use me fishing. So that's really what this is all about. Looking goofy in that. What's that?
Did you catch anything?
From that spot, I don't think so. But I did that day. I caught big guys, like big guys, like that. They were monsters. If you string them all together, then it's maybe like that. I am not a great fisherman, but have fun anyway. Okay, so just for a quick review, in this last class we introduced groups and components and why you would use groups and components, and talked a little bit about how you create those and a little bit about editing them, and so I assume that for those of you who are in that last class, obviously you caught that, and for all of those of you who have showed up, you are confident and good and ready to learn about advanced components. Either that or there's some more interesting, and there's only so much you can handle of me in a day. So that's okay too. But we're going to do face me components first, and then we're going to go into component nesting, which is really where we're going to spend the brunt of the time this morning. Because component nesting is, if you haven't done it, it's kind of daunting. That's okay. Okay, these are face me components. This morning we talked about just creating sort of freestanding components, and we also talked about creating cutting or window components. Face me components, thus named because there's no depth to these, nothing at all. However, from a sort of user's point of view, they look pretty okay. Because they always face you, and this is true of these trees or people, any of these sort of things. So we want to talk about creating these and then give you a few tips about them, about creating them as well. Some of these trees you'll notice are not actually one flat face, but are made up of several. When I started creating these, I found that creates even a little bit more illusion of depth to these, and which is just kind of a nice tip to use. But that's where we're going to start, is create one of these face me components. So I'm going to start a new file. And I'm just going to import, or in fact, you can just drag in an image. If it's a JPEG, other standard image type, you can just drag it straight into SketchUp. Or if you want, you can import it through the import menu. So you bring this in, and the first thing you have the option to do is scale this. I'm not going to worry about size right now. Just bring it over. It is looking straight down. You could continue modeling like that, or you could make some changes, but I'll go ahead and turn this right side up. When this image is brought in, SketchUp automatically groups it, and so we get the rotation tick marks, which means I can just hover over that and quickly move it up. So a couple tips about creating face me components. Usually, you'll create them from images of trees or people or this sort of thing. And it just makes sense. You try and get an image that's pretty straight on. You wouldn't try to get an image, where you're looking way down at somebody, up, this sort of thing. And so that's that. We'll come in, and I'm actually going to go up and turn perspective off, and then choose just a front view, which again, just for the purposes of making these, I find just makes it a little easier. The last thing is, as we start to trace this out, some of these edges are easy to see, but it becomes even easier if you turn X-ray mode on. Then you get it grayed out, but your edges really stand out. So I find that to be useful as well. I'm not going to spend a lot of time creating this. But I'll try to give you a few tips along the way. Now, obviously, there are tons of these type of components in the warehouse. There's some available already in your component library. If you don't like to, you obviously don't have to make your own. We're going to go over it so that you have some sort of understanding of ways that you could, but this may not be the type of component that you'll ever want to create. It's up to you. Mostly I'm trying to get Tommy back there to be able to create his own, because he's always coming to me and be like, make me a component, make me a component. And like, you think I'm joking, but I'm not. I've got the Tommy components going on. Now this happens. Now I talked about, I'm not worried about scale as of yet. And based on the template you've chosen, if you want to put more detail in here, and I'm snapping to every 1/4 inch, meaning that I can't put any more detail than that in. Again, without worrying about scale, I'm just grab everything, scale it up so that I don't have to worry about that, or I could change my units, but I can go to the front view and create this. Some people like to use the freehand tool with something like a Wacom tablet or so and then trace these over. I don't like the freehand tool. Those of you who are in the basics class know that. I don't like it at all. Not even for this, because it just doesn't give me the control I want. All right, so moving ahead. I'm being really rough. This is good to observe. Sometimes your edges break and sometimes they don't. I don't think I drew that one correctly. There we go. All right, so moving along, trying to get done. Now, one of the things that happens, this is going to be an awful component. Is that you get this sort of, if I were to turn the X-ray off, you could see that we have some surfaces created and some not. So I want to talk about a few tips that will help you to get around that and make that work better for you. Use hat. Seriously, it's going to look awful. That's okay. So, as we talked about, we have some surfaces created and some not. And a good way to get around that is you have cases like this where you may not want to see that line, such as that line right there, or depending on what you're wearing, you may. But you go ahead and close it in so that you get a surface and then just hide that edge. A good way to hide it is holding the Shift key down and then with the eraser key, erasing it. So now I don't have those edges shown, but they still work to create my surface. So let's do that here, and then I'll hide that edge. So now that we've got this rough outline, when I create components, my personal preference is to put in a little more detail than this and then actually just paint it with colors and create this sort of non-photorealistic component. But you can do it either way. You can create a more photorealistic one if you like. So for that purpose, let me copy this over and we'll do both ways. So in this case, I'll go to my colors, say the markers, and come in and paint this and paint the shirt something else. And sometimes it's helpful to turn it off. And yeah, I'm painting myself buff. There we go. I like that. Okay, so we have a rough component, or ready to be. It's not a component yet. So that's one way to do it, go in and paint your colors. Sometimes I like to come in and you put just little, say, this would be, oops, a darker blue. That's not darker blue. Some little shadows, something like this. But it all depends on how much detail you want. The purpose of Face Me components is that there's not a lot of detail that you have, right? Which means you can put lots of them in your scene. So you run the risk of getting carried away if you're trying to put in little subtle shadows or to make it look a little more detailed. But it's your personal preferences. Over here, to make this work, we need to explode this image so that we can actually use it as a texture. So I'm going to right-click on this image and say, explode. Now, if we've drawn it correctly, it actually should merge in pretty nicely, and it did. So now I can erase out the rest of this, and I've got, let me erase this too. So I've got, so I've got these two different components. When you create a photorealistic component with an image, it's very helpful. Oftentimes you'll want to erase the edges, or I'm sorry, hide the edges entirely. So in this case, you could hold the Shift key down and hide these edges so that you don't have those edges showing up. Or I'm just going to go to an edge mode, select all my edges, and then say hide those. But when I go back to texture mode, then I'm done. Question, yes?
I think I missed a step. You put a texture on a surface to start this.
I did not put a texture on a surface. I just actually just dragged it in. So I took this image and I just pulled it in directly to SketchUp. Now what happens, and so I could scale that and say done. What I did do is, and this works even just for any type of geometry, so let's just draw a rectangle over that surface, right? If I right-click on the image itself and choose Explode, that image, which was sort of grouped, is now exploded, which means it merges with the geometry that was also on top of it. It's that whole merged geometry that we avoid, that we try to avoid with groups. In this case, it works for us. It just easily merges together and then erase out the geometry we don't need. So that's how we can create sort of these type of components. Or I'm sorry, work towards creating them. Now we do need to create them as components. So start with this one. I'm going to select all the geometry and say make it a component. All right, so fishing me. Oops, I got too button happy. Let's make this component, which means I'll have to replace that last one. Always face camera is an option. It's not checked, but if we check it, then now we're going to have a face me component. The important thing here is to change the axis so that it faces us like we want it to. And let me show you how we don't want it to work. By default, the axis is over here at whatever the farthest side your geometry over on the left side. I'm going to set this gluing plane even farther over here as an example of how this should not work. Create this. Okay, this is just, we can't even get this to work because the axis that it's rotating it about is over here, the component's over here. And a face me component works on the axis. So if the axis is right here, it works like this. If the axis is over here, it works like this. So by putting that axis far away, we've created an awful, useless component. Although some people have used that to create this sort of fake animations in SketchUp where they had these cars turning these corners by putting the axis way back here, and then you'd have a road and they'd figure out how to do it. So, but that's not typical usage. It's just something that sometimes you could try. I'm going to undo that. This time we'll do it correctly. Select the geometry, make this a component. Don't worry about naming it. Always face camera. Shadows face sun. That's a good thing generally to have on. I'll show you why. Set gluing plane. You do want to set your own gluing plane. Don't accept the default, which is over here. Even though that's not far away, it's still not at the center. So I'm going to set it, say, right here at these feet. Click once, pull away, set the red axis, and then I'm setting the green axis now. You do want to be careful. You see how if I pull forward, that blue axis is down. It causes some problems, so I'd want to make sure green is back, blue is up, and create that. Okay, now it's going to behave more correctly. Yes?
Could you guys do that again with setting the axis a little higher on the screen?
Was it not shown? Yes, let's do it again. Let's do it on this component. Now, I'm going to select this component. Just to be sure, I'm going to go into View, Hidden Geometry, just to make sure I select all of its edges as well, all those edges that we hid, and make that a component. Again, we're going to say always face camera and set the gluing plane.
Can you just pan up because these
Everybody's head's in the way, so if you're ready.
Oh, thank you. Like this?
yeah.
Okay, thanks, Tommy. And by clicking, I've gone and set my axis strangely, but that's okay because you can do this multiple times, right? So I'm going to set the gluing plane at these feet. Click once to plant it, and now you see I'm setting the red direction. And here's my red axis of the entire model. I just want to line those up. So right there, red axis, click once. And now as I move back, mostly I just want to make sure that blue axis is up. If it's up, then I'm safe. So click again. My axis is set correctly, and create that. So then I can say View, turn my hidden geometry off, and I've got these two components. I still am in perspective mode. I'm not, I'm sorry. Let me turn perspective on. Take these guys, move them down to the origin. That little toggle for shadows face the sun, let's turn the shadows on and show you what that will do for you. Display shadows. This means that no matter how we turn these guys, if the sun truly were over there, you see we'd have nothing because there's nothing going on. They're paper thin. So that's what shadows face the sun means. And generally, it's what you want to leave on. Otherwise, you will, as it turns, you'll get this paper thin shadow that's just a line. So there we go. There's our face me components. Any questions on that? We'll keep on going. Okay. Excuse me.
One question. When you put this axis, the figures were high in the air.
Correct.
Is this, when you're going to insert, it's going to go the way or always go to a 0, 0?
When I put the axis, they were high in the air, but the axis doesn't matter where they were. The axis is that component axis. So as I move that component axis moves with it.
So when you insert right now, it's going to go to
Correct, to the ground plane.
the ground.
And one last thing that I didn't do, again, I didn't worry about scale, so I should have checked how high I had made it and scaled it down. Being a little sloppy, sorry. Okay, so we're now going to get into component nesting. This is the meat of the discussion. And in doing so, we're just going to build from scratch a table and some chairs, and hopefully try and communicate where component nesting will be a benefit to you. So, let's start creating this table. Let's make it, say, 4 foot by, maybe 4 is too long, but say 4 foot by 2 foot table. Pull it up to 2 inches, select it, and I'm going to make it a group. Group to start out with. And let's say move it up in the air, I don't know, 36 inches. Okay. So now let's build out the legs for this table. A rectangle, pull it down. I can access my origin to see how far I want to pull it down. Probably I'll need to make this a little bigger, but I'm going to select that leg, triple clicking on it, and make it a component. Table leg, and create this. Now, just for the purposes to help you understand what happens when I mirror this, I'm going to create some ridiculous off-growth of this table leg. That we'll get rid of later. Okay. Going to take this leg and copy it over. So now we have these two components, 2 instances of this one component, I should say. And then with a scale tool, I am going to mirror this. Okay. Some of you will be familiar with the flip along command. I never use it. I can never figure out which direction to flip along. I can't. I just don't know. So I use the scale tool. You can mirror things with the scale tool just by understanding which direction you want to mirror this in. If I wanted to mirror it vertically, I'd grab the middle grip from the top or bottom and mirror it, vertically, right? And you can mirror it all, I can stretch it far down and just type in -1 to get a negative 100%, or it's a mirror. So I'm going to undo that. In this case, I want to mirror it about this direction. So I'm going to take it back. It will also snap at -1. For those of you who can see, down in the corner here, down here, it'll say -1, or just type in -1. So I have a mirror. Now here's something. Oh wait, let me do this again. Now I'm going to select both of these, copy them, and mirror them. And scale it so that I can mirror it back. -1. Okay, so now I've got these table legs all mirrored and they're all components. Okay, so if I edit any one of these, I have all those changes happening exactly where I want them to be. So by setting it up correctly beforehand, this is going to work towards our advantage. Of course, I haven't placed these components very well. However, check this out. This is fun. I'm going to take these components and I'm going to move each one by this corner to this other corner. So I'll take this one, move it from this corner to here. I'm going to do that for each one. Now I don't want these components to be at the corner. So what I do now is edit one of these components, select it, and with the move tool I just move it in, say 2 inches, and move it back, say 2 inches. Very, very easy to do. Very nice. And now we can get rid of this sort of ridiculous outgrowth that we created. So I'll erase that. Yeah, question, Daniel.
Let's say you wanted to edit just 2 of the components and not the other.
Daniel, you're not allowed to ask questions. Besides, you know the answer to that. The question was, let's say you want to edit just 2 of the components and not the other 2. The answer is make unique, but we're not getting that right now. No. Peter, take him out of here.
Hey, me to sit in here.
Fine. Okay, so getting rid of that, let's actually do something that's a little more meaningful.
Excuse me.
Yes.
How come you took 3 of them individually to the corner, but then you could just select one and move them all in?
Because components, when you're editing a component, and the question was how come I just moved them to the component to the corners and then I could select just one and move it. The key to the components is that when you do something and you're editing a component, changes happen to all the components, no matter what you're doing, which means that if I select this component and I move it, understand that I'm not editing the component. That's the difference. And that's a key thing that you're going to have to really dig into this morning is understand when you're editing a component. It's going to become very crucial as we get into component nesting. Yes, question in the back.
You're inverting the legs of the back how they're moving in and out in relation to each other. If you hadn't done the invert with the scale, would it be moving in the same way as the other ones?
So the question was, if I had not inverted them, would I still get the same behavior? And if I take, for example, a couple copies here, and I did not invert these, I just made some copies, and I grab this one, and I move it, see, they're all moving those 4 the same. Whereas you can see the legs under the table, because we inverted them, because we mirrored it this way, and then we mirrored it this way, we got the behavior we want. Okay. So anytime you're building something like this, and there would be many things like this, mirroring it from the start and building in that component is going to be very beneficial to you. Yes, it's very crucial that you invert them, mirror them, however you want to say it. It means that we can now come in and add a lot of detail by editing just one of these components. So I'm going to double click, edit this component. Let's say, we'll go from the midpoint, add a skirt here, pull this out, and I'll just reference, say, the midpoint of the table. And then, oh, I lost my line, that's okay. And I'm going to pull this out and reference the midpoint of the table here. All right, any details that we want to put in here, easy to do so because we've set it up correctly. That's the whole point of this, is saying, we set it up correctly to start, so now we've got that. Same thing on the other side. Okay. It's all about building it correctly from the start. Yes?
So if you didn't do the mirroring and inverting from the start, all this wouldn't be working like this?
No, it would not.
Gotcha.
The question was, if we didn't mirror it from the start, it wouldn't be working like this. Correct. We'd have all of them pushing in the same direction instead of towards each other.
So if
Yes?
you delete those lines in the center, will it just, the form still stay the same?
So the question is, if we delete the lines in the center, will the form still stay the same? Of course, you don't want to see those lines. Here's what you do. You can't delete them. If we were to edit this, select those lines and delete them, we'd lose our geometry. We can hide them. And this is a point I made in the earlier class. What's better is I can take and just make a copy of one of these and start working on this and have it affect the rest of these over here. So what happens is, let me just show real quick. If I edit this, select these edges, right-click and hide them. You see they don't show. Nobody knows that you've built this like a genius. They just know that you look like a genius, right? Here's a tip for you though. When you are doing this sort of thing, oftentimes because, we can see it over here, we hid that inside surface as well. I have found that what works best is if you delete that surface that's between the two. You don't need it, delete it. You do need those edges around because we can't get by without those, but you delete that inside surface, select your outside edges, and hide them.
Now, why did you delete the surface?
The reason I did that is I have found that when you create components like this, that leftover surface, if you don't delete it, sometimes you get flickering, and it's just sort of a little indicator that you still have something there. We're not seeing it very much in this example. It's just something that I've found does get in the way. So as a general rule, I usually delete the surface, hide the edges.
Is it Z-fighting with the other one?
It's Z-fighting, yes. Z-fighting, which means two surfaces on top of each other, are each trying to display and each trying to be like, watch me, and yeah, that's Z-fighting. If you want a more technical term, Mark Limber back here can give you a more technical Z-fighting term. I don't know if mine's really that good, but Z fighting, sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah. The question was, when I build the legs, for example, this table, and I added those abnormalities, do I do that usually, generally, to use as a reference or not? And I recommend that if you're new to this, go ahead and do it so that you do have a reference. But once you get familiar with this, you won't. You'll just build this stuff out, and you're very familiar, and you'll copy it, mirror it, and you'll be moving very smoothly. You usually don't need to. But absolutely, do it from the start if you need a reference point. Yes?
Can you mirror it and copy it simultaneously? Yeah.
Question is, can you mirror and copy simultaneously? Answer is no. You have to copy it first, then mirror it. There might be a Ruby script that allows you to do that. I think there, but I can't speak towards that.
What's the difference between mirroring and inverting?
The difference between mirroring and inverting,
Yeah.
nothing. I could right-click on this and, are you talking about flip along?
No.
Oh, well then there's no difference.
Okay.
And
You can copy, paste, and place, and then
yes, but we're going to get to paste in place in just a little bit. But I won't give you as hard a time as I give Daniel, because, yeah.
So if you hold down the control key, you don't get a copy as you scale it?
No. The question is, if you hold down control, you don't get a copy as you scale it. If I scale this and I hold control down, it scales from the middle, but it does not scale a copy. Okay. So, I'm going to delete this out. And the nice thing that happens is I say, well, this table is not as big as I wish it were. I'm going to add another 18 inches in this direction, and then I'm going to grab these two, move them over to here. I know I moved them 2 inches in, so I'll move them back. But I very easily can come in and fix that, and I say View, Hidden Geometry. If I need to grab these edges, line them up with the midpoint, and turn my hidden geometry off. So let's work at, we haven't talked about component nesting yet at this point. Introduced mirroring, which very important and a good introduction to nesting. We're going to build, as we said, a chair. So let's start to build that. We'll make this chair about this big, about so big, and move it up. So at this point, we're going to kind of do a similar exercise that we just did. Although I'm going to make this a component, and we'll say chair seat. And in fact, why don't I pull this back? I'm going to, right from the start, delete that surface, take this component, copy it, mirror it, bring it back. And at this point, I'm not going to worry about hiding those edges yet, because we're still building. We're still in the point of building. I am, however, going to select both of these, right-click, and make that a component. So these two halves, I'm now making into a new component. Usually I would have named them halves, but okay, so now we have that component. And we're going to let it be for a little bit. Here's what happens. Here's how you can build in some additional efficiency. Before, on this table example, right, we went in, and at this point we said we made one leg. I'll pull it down, make it a component, etc., right? And then we copy it one time, select both those, copy them back, move them in place, just like we did before. This time, we're not going to need to do all that, because what happens is that we were smart from the beginning. We now have two mirrored halves and this inside a component. So I'm going to come in, and this is where this understanding how you're editing is important. So again, if I double click once, you see I'm not editing the seat component itself. I can't push-pull anything. It's not editing that itself. To do that, I would double-click again, and you see how now there's a sort of two boxes of dotted lines. Yes?
Can you show the outliner window?
The question is, can I show the outliner window? And I'd like to not just yet. The outliner, it will show this family tree, but it might be too confusing at this point. We are going to talk about the outliner. But just to start, you need to understand, as you get into component nesting and into levels of components, you need to very much understand where you're editing. And really, the only way to get good at that is to practice it. You are not going to learn it by watching this. Sorry, that's the reality. But hopefully if you get the idea of the thing, then you go and practice it. So what this does for us, so if I double click once, I'm editing at one level. If I wanted to make this seat a little differently, let's say, and I drew a rectangle, I'm drawing it outside of the level of these other components. It doesn't do anything for me. So let me undo that. However, if I come in, double click again, and now if I draw that same rectangle, I'm actually editing that next level, and it works correctly, right? You say, okay, that's well and fine. Well, why did you nest them together in the first place? Well, here's one example. Again, with the seat, the leg. Before we had to copy it 3 times and move them out and this sort of thing. This time, I'm going to come in and edit this at one, let's just say one level. Now, if I drew this rectangle and I were actually editing the seat, right, I'd get this on both sides. Well, that might be what you want, but I want that leg to be separate geometry from the seat. I want to be able to adjust it separately. I don't want them to be combined. So this is not what I want. I want to be outside one, and I want to create the leg, pull it down, make it a component. Chair leg, create that. Now I've got a number of different components all inside this larger component.
It wouldn't be easy when you drew the box, make component right away, and then edit this?
That's also a good way. Suggestion was when you draw the first box, make it a component right away. Absolutely. It's your preference. And I'm going to copy this across, scale it, and move it over. Now, someone brought up earlier this idea called paste in place. By drawing this outside of the seat, if you will, we've been able to create it as a component and not have it tie in with this other. However, we do want this replicated on the other side, of course. Well, we can do that very easily with something called paste in place. I'm going to select both these chair legs, and remember that we're outside of the actual seat, right, that we've mirrored. So I select both of those. I'm going to come to the edit menu, and I'm just going to cut those. So they're gone. But now I'm going to edit, double click, and so now I'm actually editing the seat itself. Go back to the edit menu, and if you say paste, it lets you paste them where you want. But if you say paste in place, it remembers exactly where they were, and by pasting them into that component, it's mirrored to the other side. So we still got this larger component. Let's use this paste in place to our advantage again. Let's come back here, and actually let's double click a couple times. When I'm editing components at various levels, I sometimes get double click happy because that just sort of works. You're like, all right, whoa, where was I? And you just sort of double click until you find the native geometry that you're trying to find. That oftentimes works for me. So I double click until I find this. Okay, that's what I want to edit. I want to pull this up a little bit because we're going to make a chair back. So maybe we'll do something like that. So I click outside and come in. Pull that up, and we'll make it a component. And we'll say backing, something like that. Create that. And maybe we'll make it a little, let's say, instead of just copying it straight over, we'll use the rotate tool and array it this way so that we've got. Now what we can do is just select these, right? We've got these components. And again, say, okay, now that we've created them outside and we haven't worried about this geometry getting on top of each other, come in and we'll cut those again and say, well, at what level do we want to place these? Well, we can't place them at this level. This is the general. If you paste in place here, that's the general chair as a whole. That's not the mirrored seat, so that's not what we want. Double click again. Let's paste in place here so we get that effect. So that seems to work pretty well. Now let's create a box here, pull it up a little bit, and I'm going to select this, move it up. But in this case, I want to create this arched back, but I don't want to necessarily worry about taking half an arc and mirroring it. Maybe I just want to get this banged out a little faster. So create this, pull this down, double click, select this, make it a component.
Why wouldn't you just make that a group?
Absolutely, I might just make it a group. Because I don't intend to copy this, question being, why wouldn't I just make it a group? I don't intend to make this a copy. Unlike the chair legs, unlike the seat, which we split, unlike the backs, which all are copies, there's a reason to make those a component. This guy, I don't really intend to copy it again, so a group would have been a great option for it, because it'd keep it out of your library. But I'll move it back. In this case, again, I'm going to paste it in place, so I'll cut it. But again, at what level do we want to put this into our component? This time, we don't want to go in all the way to the chair half, right? If we paste it here, then we're going to have two of them, because it's mirrored, right? So we have two. So this time, instead of that, undo that, we only want to paste it in at one level deep. So we'll say edit, paste in place here, so that we only have one of them. So now we have the chair. Maybe now I'll come in and select these edges and hide them. Actually, let's see, wasn't sure where I was editing, but it's easy to find out. Okay, edit, hide. Put it there, and then I'm going to rotate some copies. I'll say 3 of those. Move it in, make them look a little more interesting. Okay. So again, hopefully you're getting the notion of, by embedding these components within each other, which is called component nesting, you start to build in a lot more efficiency, what you can do at certain levels. So if we come in, again, and I said, well, I want this chair to be a higher back, and I'll catch you in a half second. I want this chair to have a higher back. I can come in just one level where this component resides, use the move tool, move it up, and they're all affected. And now I can come in another level, and a third level, and then use push-pull, pull the backs up. And you see how badly I aligned that thing, but that's the idea, is that by nesting these inside each other, you build in a lot of efficiency because you only have to do certain things at certain levels. There's a question over here, then we'll.
This helps your efficiency as far as your workload. What about the memory efficiency as far as
The question is, it helps your efficiency as far as your workflow, but does it also help your SketchUp speed, your computer processing? And the answer is it does. It does help to have to have this stuff not all in native geometry. It also improves your file size greatly. We looked at this in the earlier class, a file where I had this classroom made up of various components, and it, as built, it had a lot of detail in it. It was around 400K file size, but once it was exploded with all the detail, it was about a 5 gig file. Okay, so exact same geometry, but if it's built out of components that are copied versus just native groups or native geometry, it's a lot bigger. And yes?
I just think
Just backtracking, why do we cut before we, copy and place? Why were we cutting the items before we paste them?
You need to either copy or cut an item to paste it. Otherwise, it's going to paste the last item. So if I wanted to copy this chair so that I could paste it, I just, if instead I come in and copy this item so that I can paste it, it's just going to paste the last one, and since that's the one that we want to focus on, that's why we copy or cut it, because that's the one that we want to place next. Does that make sense? There was a question here, and then...
I just didn't notice when you did it, but did you select that whole chair at the end and make a component of that?
No, because we made a component from the beginning. Now, it's oftentimes, we're just adding on. Sometimes you will build these out as different pieces and then make a component of them all at the end. That's also a great way of working, just a different way. There was a question over here. And
Maybe to the gentleman, why use cut instead of just copy? If you copy and paste, you have to go back and delete the original. If you cut, you delete it, and you copy it, and then you paste. You save a step.
The observation was why you cut instead of copy is that if you copy, you leave the original, and then when you paste in place, you've got to delete the original. If you cut, you're deleting and copying at the same time. Then when you paste in place, you get you don't have the original here, and then we'll come back here.
Once you're done modeling your component, you have a series of components nested with it. Now, is there a way to merge them all together, or just create a single component so that by the time you finish out your scene, you end up having several hundred pieces that are components, where in reality you may only have like 6.
So, in your question, you're suggesting that, say, for example, this chair, once we're done with it, we explode it and then make it one component. That is the only way to do it, but even though you do build quite an extensive library, I still recommend that you don't explode it. You've lost the efficiency that you built in, the file size benefits that you've built in. If I explode this chair, then now I account for every one of these backing slats, as opposed to right now, SketchUp only counts as one. So even if I make this whole chair a component, explode everything, and then make it a component, I have a larger component than I had originally. And I've lost the ability to go back in and make those easy edits. So I'd recommend not doing that, but you can. You'd explode it. Question back here, and then I'm sorry, I've been back here.
My question was about the make unique. How does the nesting of the make unique work with the components when you try to?
So the question was about make unique, which we deferred. Let me real quick show that. How that will work is within the nesting. Let's say we take this and this slat and we make them unique. And you do that by selecting them, right click, and we say make unique. Make unique, you might have saw a little, now have a new component over here, makes those unique, but because we're editing this and because we built it in, if we edit those now, that's going to happen around here too. So we've made them unique in every instance that we included them in. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes, sir.
Wouldn't it have been easier if you were putting just the legs on the chair, use guidelines and put
I do that all the time. The question was, wouldn't you just put some guidelines in the corners, placing the legs and move them? Absolutely. Sometimes I don't think straight, and so that's how, I honestly think that's how I came across at one point. I'm like, oh man, I didn't put guidelines, now I've got to place these all individually, or I could just put them in the corners and then move them in. It's just an example of how components can work for you. Yes?
Can you show us how you would edit and modify a 3D person?
The question is, can we talk about how to edit and modify a 3D person, and not in the space of this class?
Is it possible?
It is possible. It's not advisable.
Virtually impossible. I mean, to get anything that looks organic.
Organic modeling, far beyond the scope of what we can cover here. Organic modeling, there are definitely some tools to do it, some approaches to do it. Not something we can address right now, sorry. But check with me afterwards if that's something you're interested in. Yes?
When I do work like this and I use guidelines, I get a lot of infinite guidelines pointing in all directions. It gets very messy. Is there an easy way to limit the length of those guidelines?
Question was, when you use guidelines and you have a lot of guidelines, it gets pretty messy. And so can you limit how far those guidelines extend? And the answer is no, those are going to extend to infinity. However, there is an option to hide guidelines. And if you can toggle that to a keyboard shortcut. You go to edit and you can, well, I don't have any guidelines in here, but you can hide those. So let's take a few more questions, then I want to cover a few more things.
The dowels on the back of the chair, if you wanted to show where those intersected with the seat, how would you do that? Because they're two different components.
Correct.
Can you show that?
So the question was if we wanted to intersect or show how they intersected these dowels with the back of the chair, how would you do that? Because they're separate components. Here's one way, and the way I think I would do it. I'll just come in to, say, this component. Actually, what I'll do is take these 4 components, and I'm going to copy them. I'm sorry. Copy them, and then I'm going to paste them out here, explode them, which I did with keyboard shortcut, and just select the bottoms. Copy those. And if I was smart, I would have done it in the same place, so I would have had the advantage of paste in place. You could do that too, absolutely. The observation is, can't you just come in here and say, well, just take this surface, say intersect with the model, and come out, and that will, as you see, I'm going to hide these real quick. Do this. I was doing it the hard way. Sometimes I do that. Not always. Sometimes you just don't always pick the best way. Yes?
When you bring in a component from, say you built another model and you reference it in, is there a way to, when you open the file, to automatically update that?
Question was, when you bring a component in from another file, is there a way to automatically update that if you change it in your other file? I don't believe there is. Your components are not linked across files, except in that you can create component libraries, which is a good segue, and I'm going to quick jump into, let's talk a little bit about the component browser and how you can build your own libraries of components. You're not allowed to ask questions. That's Ryan Alden. He's a buddy of SketchUp, and I will not take questions from Ryan. He's trying to heckle. So, this component browser, let's say we have the chair, seat, hole, as we named it, is now this chair. And we want to save this out to be able to use in other models. Well, there's various ways to do this. We can right-click on it and say, Save As, and I can just save it to my documents or a certain folder out here, chair seat hole, and I can save it. So you could easily bring that in. But when you're doing entire libraries and this sort of thing, there's certainly a better way to do it. Your component browser has this expand option, which means that when you look at these various libraries, you can look at different libraries simultaneously, and I'm going to mess up my libraries here. You can drag from one library to another. What you can do then is create your own libraries and drag these models to those libraries. So let's say I'm going to do that. First of all, I am going to, I'll just go to my desktop. Or my documents, and I'll say I'm going to create a new folder and call it components. Now in here, I want to say open or create a library. And by the way, you could do this from either menu, open or create a library. But I'm going to do it down here so I can drag them in. Open or create a library, my documents, and components, okay. Now I don't have any in there, but if I go to the house icon, I could say, save as, and I could save them there in my documents components, save, and now it appears. Or I can just drag them down here. Now, this is going to remember this library for this, this model. If you want to, every time you open SketchUp, to be able to access this library, you come in and you say, here I might ask your help, Ryan. Where's add to favorites?
Right there. Right there.
Second choice.
Thank you. I'm losing it. Add library to favorites. This is going to add this library. You can choose a library to your favorites. So now that every time you start SketchUp, it's going to remember this library. And of course, you can create sub-libraries. If you save this library, or if this library is on a network, then you can have multiple people saving to the library and have shared components. Now, one thing to keep in mind is if you brought a component in, I bring this component into this model, but this is something that's shared over the network. And my buddy Ryan goes in and makes all sorts of awful changes to my chair because he's just that way. And the next time I open my model, it doesn't reference that library. It already knows that it was in the model. So it's not going to update automatically. If you change the library instance, on your network or something like that, unless you bring that new one in, it's not instanced to that. It's instanced only within that model that you have open. So
Ryan isn't satisfied.
So Ryan is thwarted. His evil plans. I'm glad you're here. I pick on you. So yes, question.
What if you move that folder out of your documents folder, move it somewhere else?
If you move it, then I believe you'd need to point to it again. It doesn't automatically go out and look for it. Any other questions on that? One thing, Peter, what's our timeline? When are we? Do we go till quarter till 12? Anybody? Quarter till. So we've got another 10 minutes. Question here, and then we'll come up here.
I was just going to say, back to my earlier question, now your chair is just one component where it started as 5. It kind of did what I was asking.
What's happening is SketchUp is just, call it a bug. It actually is still the various components that we created. It's not showing it. Let me pull up, as someone earlier suggested, the outliner. The outliner we'll talk about is another way to view and access your components that shows your actual hierarchy. Okay, so I'm going to collapse this. if I said I want to select, and you see there's 5 instances here, but I can select any of these, it shows that. If I expand it, I can get directly right into, without double clicking and stuff, I can dig right to that very one I want through the outliner. That's one of the advantages of the outliner. There's others. But it shows, the outliner shows your hierarchy of nesting, and we'll talk about that as well. So there were 2 other questions, and we'll talk outliner.
That was my.
Okay, great.
Are there any reasons not to add a library to the favorites?
Is there any reason not to add a library to the favorites? Probably not. I mean, just if you have stuff that you, I don't know. Probably you want to add it to your favorites. And a nice thing is that you can come in and if I go components, I want to add a library and let's say I've got 3D Basecamp. Let's see if I find my components. I've got all these subfolders in here, but I'm just going to add the top level. So I can say OK and add it to favorites. Well, same thing. My components, OK. But now you've got them organized too. So you can add a top level and then sub-levels and such as this. So I can come in and add all my people or my trees and this sort of thing. Yes?
Are you going to talk about hide rest model?
Yes, that's a good question. But since Ryan's sitting next to you, I think he... And I'm kidding. Let me talk about that in a second. One more question, and let's talk about outliner and hide rested model.
So if I wanted to copy a component or element that I know I've already created, how do I, scooch into all the hierarchy, pull it out?
So you're saying you want to copy... What's that?
I created it already, so I go find it and then pull it out without messing up with any of these.
Without messing up the rest of it, I just dig in, grab the one that you want, copy them, and paste it out. Yeah, absolutely. So there were 2 questions, and we haven't talked much about the outliner. Let's talk about the outliner, and let's talk about changing your editing, your viewing options. What happens is when you're in here and you're editing this sort of thing, you have a lot of components, a lot of stuff in your scene. A lot of stuff can get in the way. And there are ways to come up and say, I want to hide the rest of the model so that I only see the component I'm editing. Or I can also come up and say, I want to hide similar components so that I only see just that. And the basic way to do that is through the edit menu, the view menu, component edit, and you can toggle them on and off here. The better way to do it is, as you see, there's keyboard shortcuts to it. So Alt-H, Control-Shift-H for me are hide these things. You see, and this also shows you sort of a level of what you're editing. If I double-click here, because everything else is hidden, double-click here. It gives you an indication, but if I hit Alt-H for hide rest of model, I can toggle that on or off, or I can say Control-Shift-H to toggle on the rest of those. Very handy to have. So the quick introduction, that's what it is. It's under the View, Component Edit, Hide Rest, and Hide Similar. And whatever shortcuts work for you, I'd actually recommend putting those into shortcuts to make it quicker. Now let's talk a little bit quickly about the outliner. The outliner components, and as always is the case, we run out of time before we can cover all the things we'd like to, but I'm going to do this with outliner and the component menu. So I'm going to select this, just very simple geometry, and I'm going to make it a component. I'm going to say my, let's say fig tree. I'm going to make a bunch of copies of this around at random. And I'm going to scale some of these differently because you can actually scale without editing the component. But now, the reason for doing this is in a large model, you oftentimes get a lot, you'll get very heavy geometry, you'll get a lot slowed down because you just have so much stuff going on. And one of the ways to work around that is that you swap your geometry in and out. And so under components, I'm going to say, where's my trees here? My components, my trees. I'm going to select these. And a quick way to select them, if you had a bunch of them all over the place, some that you can see and some that you can't, whatever, you could right-click on this and say, select instances, and that will select all the instances in your model. And then I'll come over here and say, replace selected. Kept the scale, replaced them out, and now we have much better looking things. But when we come back to modeling, say, okay, I need to turn those back off, so I am going to select instances, replace selected, so that I don't have that heavy geometry. Now I say that because sometimes, this is one of the advantages of the outliner, sometimes you don't have the nice, you have variations of the trees and stuff like that. I just sometimes for me, I find it easier. I'm like, I don't know which tree is which. I don't know what's going on. I can select one of these, and it shows me in the outliner what it is, and I can just do a quick, okay, hold the shift key, select them all in the outliner. That's another quick way to do it. And like I say, by clicking on any one of these, you go instantly into editing that one. You can filter this. As someone mentioned earlier, you get a lot of stuff going on. Well, if you are much better than me, I'm terrible about naming my components and groups. But you can filter, so you can say, I need to get to chair, seat. And now you can filter it down just to get what you're looking for. So Outliner is actually pretty powerful, more so than what I'm showing here, but it's a pretty incredible tool if you're getting into a lot of depth with your components and this sort of thing. What's that? Outliner is right here under your window menu. Outliner, components. It's all right here. So I think that is about the time that we have. Any other questions? In the back, then we'll come up.
Question about hierarchy and density. You make the largest component unique. How does that affect the components within it? Are they venues as well, or do you have to do it each instance?
It only affects that level. So the question was, if you make, for example, if we make this large component unique, then that means if we came in, this guy right here that is buried one level inside that we move, well, we can change that differently. However, as we know, these guys, they're not. But if we dig in deeper to the next level, now we've gotten to components that we haven't made unique. So making unique doesn't translate down through your hierarchy. It only makes unique that level that you're working at. If that makes sense. There was a question back here.
Is it possible to print your component, outline a list out, so say for a takeoff, say you're going to build those chairs, and I guess if you wrote in the size and everything like that, you can
Sure.
make a build it from the...
Question is it possible to print out your outliner sort of menu list? Does anyone know is there a Ruby script, Todd? Todd wrote a Ruby script that will do such a thing. I suggest talking to Todd. Thank you, Todd. Yes?
Does entity info tell you if something is unique or not?
Entity info will give you the name. So for example, if I go to entity info, this should be chair seat hole number 1, whereas this is just chair seat hole. But if you select multiple, then it won't tell you like which ones you have. So that sort of thing. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much for coming.